Elinor Glyn. Cecil B. DeMille said that she managed the paradox of bringing good taste and sex appeal to Hollywood and deserves more credit than he did. Samuel Goldwyn said that her name was synonymous with the discovery of sex appeal, and that she plans her personality as carefully as she does her stories. She taught Rudolph Valentino how to kiss. She transformed the image of Gloria Swanson. She created the It Girl in Clara Bow. And she was on William Randolph's yacht the night of the Thomas Ince tragedy. Mark Twain said that she came to the U.S. upon the stormwind of a vast and sudden notoriety. Dorothy Parker wrote that Madame Glyn does not flinch from plain talk. Aldous Huxley chose her book, 3 Weeks, as a vehicle for the feelies of Brave New World. Beverly Nichols wrote that it seemed that such a fiery personality should have caused only ink and not blood to flow. Anita Loos commented that she belonged heart and soul to Hollywood. That her appearance was bizarre, with her white skin contrasting with her dyed red hair and her bright green eyes. And in fact, if Hollywood never existed, Elinor Glyn would have invented it. Gloria Swanson recalled how she went everywhere and passed her fearsome verdict on everybody. People moved aside for her as if she were a sorceress on fire. Lorenz Hart wrote a lyric in the song, "My heart stood still. I read my Plato, love I thought a sin. But since your kiss, I'm reading Mrs. Glyn." Clara Bow called her a shithead. Elinor Glyn came to Hollywood at age 56 to begin a new chapter in her notorious life, and created a sexual revolution on the screen, following her groundbreaking promotion of women's sexual desires in her novel, 3 Weeks, years earlier. Infamy and outrage followed the publication of that book, where the scene of an older, married woman seducing a younger man on a tiger skin became an image imprinted on public consciousness. They were sitting on the tiger by now, and she undulated round and all over him, feeling his coat, and his face, and his hair, as a blind person might. Till at last it seemed as if she were twined about him like a serpent. And she exploited that image shrewdly. An anonymous rhyme about that scene was repeated everywhere. Would you like to sin with Elinor Glyn on a tigerskin rug? Or would you prefer to err with her, on some other fur? The book elicited enormous popularity, selling 7 million copies. Praised because she wrote about the strength of women's sexual desires, and the right to act independently as she chose. Criticized, ridiculed, banned and censored in places because of the affront to traditional morality, and a fear that it might influence the younger generation. Invited to speak at a luncheon in New York by the Pilgrim Mothers, who weren't familiar with the book, she responded to their criticism graphically. She retorted thusly, "I have never seen such an aggregation of dowds, frumps, and tabby cats. Women who are breastless, slab-hipped, and pancake-faced frights. And while you criticize me, I sold 50,000 more books last week. And tabby cats are too good for you. Sparrows are more appropriate." But the imagery that flowed from her psyche to her pen also revealed the feline traits of her personality, hinting at a darker, more predatory nature. She wrote enigmatically, "If you knew the strange effect tigerskins have on me. The touch of a tiger awakens some far-off savagery, some former life when I was unhampered and could kill for love, when I desired, without having to consider civilization. Now I live in a cage and live off bread and milk and wear sapphires." But her story begins much earlier. Hollywood was her second life. She was forced into a career as a writer because of the debts incurred from a lavish lifestyle and the gambling and drinking of her dissolute husband. Growing up idealizing the romances in literature and mythology, she had hoped for an idyllic marriage. But it had to come from within the circle of the British aristocracy in which she socialized. Her lifelong dreams of romance were the essence of her ideals and the foundation of her philosophy. As she later reflected, the dominant impulse behind every action has been the desire for romance. "I have sought it consciously, unconsciously. I have followed the gleam wisely, foolishly. Romance may be rare, but it is real and the only thing worth having." At the advanced age of 28 and not finding the perfect match, she reluctantly married Clayton Glyn, who had the lineage, but only in appearance, not in substance. Despite a romantic honeymoon when he rented the Brighton baths to watch her swim nude, long red hair flowing, romance turned to despair. He had a law degree, but never had a job. To support their indulgent lifestyle, he kept selling off portions of his estate, till he was reduced to borrowing money from anyone who would oblige. And with 2 daughters, but longing for a male heir that never came, he spent his last years gambling and drinking in dissipation. Desperate for income, Elinor drew upon her talent as a writer. An article accepted by Hearst's Cosmopolitan magazine began a prolific career, and over 3 decades she produced a long string of over 20 novels, mostly exposing the hypocritical, promiscuous lifestyles of the British aristocracy, introduced into their circle by her friends, Lady Daisy Greville, the hedonistic Countess of Warwick, and Lady Diana Manners. As her marriage failed, she began an 8-year affair with Lord George Curzon, former Viceroy of India, and a leading member of Lloyd George's war cabinet. She saw in him everything she idealized. And when his wife died and they were both single, she expected a marriage proposal. Tired of discreet rendezvous at country inns and small hotels, she yearned for a place amongst the elite, and opportunity to be a taste-maker and trendsetter. Curzon though also was desperate for a male heir, despite 3 daughters. And Elinor's scandalous reputation wouldn't help his high political ambitions. Without even having the dignity to tell her in person, Elinor found his engagement to younger rich American, Grace Duggan, splashed across the newspapers. Never again returning to the estate that he had rented for her, she burned the 500 love letters exchanged between them. Bitterly she remembered that he was a misogynist and didn't believe that women have souls. Her angst was palpable. Oh, that he who I adored, whose nobility I treasured, whose probity I worshipped, could prove so faithless and vile. After he humiliated her, she was involved with 2 other major figures of influence, Alistair Innes Kerr, and Lord Milner. But nothing further came out of those relationships. Her sister, who became Lady Lucille Duff Gordon, was also a leading figure in their social circles as the couturier to the elite of society and entertainment. Her fashion brand, Lucille, produced the costumes for the Ziegfeld Follies. And Lucy was a survivor of the Titanic, under dubious circumstances. With her literary career flourishing, Elinor traveled the courts of Europe, and drew inspiration from her travels for her stories. Still circulating amongst nobility, the rich, and the powerful, with notable visits to America and Russia between the usual European locales. And bilingual since her youth, she had an apartment in Paris, and frequently crossed between countries. But appearances were deceptive. The raw feline side of her psyche, or her inner tiger, was active at times, and Paris was a fitting environment for its expression. Having accidentally uncovered her grandfather's collection of pornography in his library, she was fascinated and drawn to that forbidden domain. And in Paris, she furtively prowled the dark bookstalls on the streets. With access to the Bibliothèque Nationale's restricted archives, she gave the leash of her inner tiger some slack. Paris was also where she renewed acquaintances with one of her idols, Sarah Bernhardt. She said that she had a sexual awakening from her influence while living in Paris. And the 2 stunning but aging redheads exchanged pleasantries with mutual admiration. Elinor's imagination was always active, and she embarked on practices learned from the New Thought movement in America to fashion her own methods of harnessing its powers. She was an early proponent of the power of attraction and the use of visualization, and disciplined herself to spend an hour every day meditating with that mindset. She explained it like this: I worked diligently to control my thoughts. I taught myself how to spend an hour a day concentrating and visualizing the richest successes which I was learning to desire. As well, she became enamored with occult theories and beliefs, especially the work of Richard Inglis, whose theories about reincarnation, cycles of civilizations, and the future direction of humanity she wholeheartedly adopted. Amongst those theories, shared by many other esoteric traditions worldwide, past and present, was that a new civilization was taking shape. Called root races, Elinor became certain that she had a special mission: to be a force of change, and help shape a new path for the next wave of civilization. She always felt instinctively that her views on sex, romance and love were meant for future generations. The Edwardian age of her youth was coming to an awkward end, accelerated by the devastating World War taking place during her current Parisian stay. She emphasized the prioritization of sexual and emotional satisfaction for women, and critiqued the institution of marriage for compromising and cheapening that objective. But her philosophy was not destructive in her mind, more corrective. She wasn't in alignment fully with the emerging flapper lifestyle, but recognized that it needed to be allowed to unfold with guidance from the likes of herself. And she was enthusiastic, saying that, "I have a message which I shall deliver everywhere." But she was a realist, and knew how hard it would be to make an impact. Most people have the brains of grasshoppers and spring from subject to subject. Their thoughts are not under their control. Their thoughts rule them. It is not they who rule their thoughts. This shrewd awareness was used to her advantage when she became a multimedia entrepreneur. But she also was a serious thinker and writer. The author of many non-fiction books and articles, mostly critiquing the prevailing social standards pertaining to romance, love and sex. Carefully described in her book, The Philosophy of Love. An old friend, the British philosopher F.H. Bradley, and she had often talked about these subjects. Bradley was characterized in her novel Halcyon. He had written an introduction to one of her books called On the Sexual in Literature, but Glyn refused to publish it. Bradley had an ethical theory that Elinor found interesting. Bradley said that each person has two sides to their personality: an inferior self, and a superior self. The superior self tries to abide by the highest ideals and values. The inferior self cannot ever meet those ideals, but is dignified in trying. The inferior self easily becomes enamored of baser desires and pursuits. But it is a mistake to think the inferior self isn't authentically part of the total self. This dynamic was a lifelong dilemma for Elinor, who constantly wrote about living by the highest ideals of love, but was being drawn away by her inferior self's attraction to transient pleasures. But her time in France had more important ramifications. During the First World War she was active, ministering to the wounded, and writing for Hearst publications. At the behest of the French government, who were aware of her popularity, she was asked to encourage American participation. And her work, and later friendship, with Hearst, continued throughout her Hollywood years. Not content to stay on the sidelines, she asked for access to the front lines, and saw atrocities and tragedies firsthand. Almost losing her life watching the horrors of war, she began a book called Destruction, which she read out loud to American troops. At the signing of the Treaty of Versailles she interviewed Prime Minister George, and wrote profiles of the leading figures. Post-war, Glyn resumed her travels. She had been to Egypt previously, and was intrigued by a spell it seemed to have cast over her. A fortuitous invitation to the Khedive Ball provided the opportunity to revisit. The first time, she felt that she was having flashbacks or picking up the subtle energy patterns emitted from the pyramids. This time, she felt this much more powerfully at the Step Pyramid near Memphis. Her feline nature seemed to be aroused more than usual. She had learned that it was the center of worship of the Egyptian deity, Sekhmet. Later revisioned as Bastet, goddess of pleasure, fertility, women's secrets, seduction. A shapeshifter usually taking on the image of cats, tigers, lions and others of that family. And worshipped with singing, dancing, and parties. And for some ceremonies, women would hail passing boats, turn their backs and lift their skirts, revealing nothing but themselves. With the overpowering narcotic smell of the Blue Lotus, she seemed to fall into a visionary trance. Or to have activated the latent extrasensory abilities she believed she had. With her inner eye she felt she was back in ancient Egypt, taking part in a ceremony in praise of Sekhmet. Intense surges of energy seemed to pulse up and down her spine. And with a group of other women, wandered down to the river banks in a daze. As boats came in sight she felt the fire in her spine turn to unbridled lust. She and the other women lewdly greeted those disembarking, and were soon partaking of what felt like a familiar ritualized sex orgy. Totally impersonal, with only the sensation of pleasure. And no sense of guilt or embarrassment because it was sanctified by the goddess. Somewhere in the distant recesses of her objective mind she recognized this as a kind of safety valve, intended to diffuse social tensions and stay in touch with natural instincts. It took some time for her to process her experience. Whatever its source, subjectively it felt as real as anything she ever had felt. From her perusal of occult literature, she deduced that the sensation was called Kundalini. A subtle energy often activated by sexual activity that can have powerful, long-term effects. She instantly associated it with the sporadic surges from what she thought of as her inner tiger. It was puzzling though because it was usually sexual imagery or thoughts that were triggers. But she acknowledged that the act had previously generated similar feelings. Another surreal transformative moment came when she was back in London. About to leave a bookstore after giving a talk, she caught a glimpse of a gawky, unruly-looking man, idly thumbing through a book in the small occult section. It was a copy of a book by H.P. Blavatsky, Isis Unveiled. Elinor had a passing idea about it and the author. Also a notorious independent woman. Unable to help herself, she started a conversation, and asked if he was interested in the material it discussed. Slowly turning with a wry smile, he said that he was Russian, and a countryman of the author. He was new to London, having recently emigrated. His name was Gritsko, formerly in the employ of Prince Boris after leaving the army. One thing he said that he missed were long romantic winter rides through the snow on a troika. And he wistfully described in detail the fun it was bouncing along, covered in furs. Another time, another place he shrugged. But the image of an exotic romantic moment stayed in the back of her mind. As they talked, she saw that he had extensive knowledge about esoteric subjects. Not just the superficial things popularized by ignorant authors. He peppered his comments with historical anecdotes, book references, and descriptions of unfamiliar practices. He said he came from the Caucasus and had lived on a commune with truth seekers, as he called them. Elinor laughingly told him that she was far below him in knowledge, but had some questions. And as she looked at him, a different sensation came over her. As she wrote in her diary, he was tall, ugly, weirdly distinguished. And a wild passionate desire for him came over me. I felt as a primitive savage might have felt. Gritsko could see it in her green eyes, but startled her with an impassioned monologue. Do you ever ask yourself what things mean? What we are? Where we are going? What is the end of it all? No, you live day by day. You cannot be a very young age. Your eyes are too wise. You have had many incarnations. The note of awakening has not yet struck. We draw the reflex of every evil and every good action. But sometimes not till the next incarnation. That is why the heedless cannot grasp the truth. They see no visible result. We are given no conscious memory of our last life. We need suffering to eliminate our faults. Otherwise it would be too easy to improve from self-interest. Fascinated, Elinor knew that he saw the big picture. She empathized with his directness and intensity. But as much as she recognized the soundness of his statement, she knew in her heart that she could never live up to such a high standard. It was as if Bradley's distinction between superior and inferior selves was appearing in a different guise. But she and Gritsko met more times. Usually with him expounding on different theories and she asking questions. She was happy that he agreed that a new root race was imminent. She was too modest to mention her self-belief in her own importance, though she could tell he knew more than he let on. She told him about her Egyptian vision, and he was respectful, saying that it was up to her to let her unconscious mind emerge more freely. Via dreams, meditation, or other methods. Maybe it was a true vision of the past. Or a previous incarnation flashback. Possibly drug-induced from the powerful Blue Lotus. Or maybe it was a creation of the imagination. Or a combination of factors. She had avoided allowing that initial feeling of lust to come out. So intrigued by his knowledge, charisma and self-assurance, she didn't want to spoil the chemistry. Then she brought up Kundalini and spoke of her inner tiger. She asked impulsively, "What do you know about this?" He smiled and said, "Let me show you how to really awaken that sleeping tiger." This interlude added energy and enthusiasm to her routine. But Gritsko left for parts unknown. She felt that a change in life was necessary. Her daughters were engaged. Her mother settled. The same routines seemed to limit her horizons. She had intensified her meditations and now kept visions of America in the forefront of her thoughts. And at the same time, in Hollywood, Goldwyn and the Lasky Famous Players studio embarked on a plan to add class to the content of their films. They came up with the eminent author idea, inviting well-known authors, mostly from England, to supply stories. Goldwyn caught his secretary, Valeria, entranced with a book she had on her lap. It was 3 Weeks, by Elinor Glyn. She said that she was too young to have read it originally, but this cheaper edition was a knockout. Goldwyn's research team brought the information that she was still active, living in Europe, and that she was still popular. And the book was about sex. It was a delicate time in Hollywood. Censorship was gaining momentum. Crusaders in religious, civic and political groups were threatening legislature and draconian controls. And even bringing up the issue of block booking. At the heart of studio monopolies. The recent sex, drug and crime scandals in the movie colony added to the scrutiny of the industry. DeMille, Griffith, von Stroheim amongst others were singled out and had to rethink their approaches. Adding a known scandalized author might make things worse. But sex sold. It just had to be presented in a non-threatening way. Dressed up and refined, but still palpable enough. The studio dispatched June Mayo to make her an offer. Herself, rich, honored, and in some way, romantically awakened again. Her inner tiger growled as much as ever. But she was feeling an urgent need to move beyond safety valve indulgence. She even felt that her sexual self was evolving spontaneously when she dreamed. Thanks to advice from her readings, she learned how to keep conscious in many of her dreams. Lucidly creating and entering them, fulfilling wishes and being drawn into unknown scenarios. Gritsko often appeared in her dreams. Invited or not, sometimes as a teacher, mostly as an erotic partner. Both of them under a variety of different guises. But recognizing each other instantly. And evoking sensations feeling more real than any experienced awake. With bodies constantly changing shapes and appearance. But moving in perfect synchronization through these changes. Gritsko wasn't the only one of her partners, however. In sleep she was an equal opportunist. And on awakening from some of these encounters she modified her visualizations to allow space for a real-world meeting. And to stimulate and evoke memories of Egypt, and just enjoy their presence, she added more cats to her household. And more tiger rugs to enhance the feel of her meditations. The cats were lazily stretching out on her desk when June Mayo knocked on her door. Chapter 7. Mayo was polite but businesslike. She explained that her studio was eager to add Elinor to their stable of creative personnel. They knew of her career and believed that she could succeed in the film industry. That her stories would make the foundation of classy and appealing movies. And they wanted to bring her to Hollywood. Elinor was intrigued, but didn't answer right away. It seemed that the power of attraction did work. She had been visualizing and meditating for an hour every morning. With life in America always one of the constants of her desires. And now it possibly could manifest in physical time and space. She kept her emotions in check, however, not wanting to appear too eager. She wanted to know the full details. Miss Mayo took papers out of her satchel and described what the contract entailed. It would pay £10,000 for 1 year. Travel costs as well. One new, usable story was required. But she would be taught about the whole filmmaking business, and future contracts at higher salaries would be forthcoming if successful. Elinor was enthusiastic. The money, as usual, was welcome. The adventure, in line with her desires. And it was a chance to remake herself in a new environment. And though she had virtually no previous knowledge about films, and had only seen 2 previously, it was a chance to expand her creative work in a new medium. She had toiled for 2 decades in the book milieu, and was looking towards the future. There was no denying the massive popularity of movies. Whatever fame and notoriety she already had could be multiplied enormously. And she would also have the chance to play her role as expert advisor and guide about romance, sex, and love. And contribute to the edification of far more people than she ever reached before. But she didn't immediately sign. Used to having hired domestics taking care of all the day-to-day drudgery, she insisted on the provision of maid, secretary, chauffeur, and importantly, dressmaker. God forbid she would have to shop retail for her outfits. And she also required first-class travel, both by ocean liner and luxury train. Accustomed to the most self-indulgent stars and their often eccentric demands, Miss Mayo had no problem agreeing. And seemingly, another synchronistic opportunity came along at this time. Hearst had been impressed with her war contributions and stories. Their distant relationship was cordial and professional. He offered her $200 a week for 2 600-word articles when she arrived in America. By the end of the decade it had increased to 6. And she would later enter Hearst's world more directly. When the time came, it wasn't all that easy to say goodbye and leave the continent. But the appeal of the new beginning was a necessary stimulus for body and soul. Always meticulous about her health and appearance, she felt confident and competent. Embarking on the Mauritania, Elinor had ample time ahead of her to strategize and visualize the next scenes of her personal story. Foregoing some of the usual niceties and opportunities to socialize, she spent time reflecting on who she was and where she was going. She wrote some of those thoughts in her diary. One must have vision so that one can look ahead and not stumble over retained prejudices. People so want a thing, yet not have enough will to eliminate qualities in themselves that most obviously prevent their obtaining those desires. It was a reminder to stay focused, retain her vision and purpose, and watch every word. It could be disastrous if she let some of her unguarded thoughts slip out in public. And she had to keep reminding herself to stay positive. Creating a mantra, she repeated it to herself regularly. I am an optimist. I don't believe in pessimism at all. I believe that there is a power that guides us. She realized that how she would be perceived would begin with first impressions. And that she had to be attentive to how she presented herself. What kind of image would be most effective in achieving name recognition? She had been a controversial figure in the literary world. But she was younger then. And now entering a different world at another time. And facing the challenge of a new medium. Innately snobbish, and with an inflated ego, she took pride in her looks. Her vanity obscuring how she might appear to others. But she also was shrewdly cunning, aware that individual eccentricity draws the most attention. Sarah Bernhardt always remaining a figure of envy. One new decision she made to add a small touch of exotic color to her image was to use the title, Madame Glyn, rather than plain old Mrs. It was used in France, but now in America it would sound unique. As well, it reinforced her own shift in self-image. One thing that she did work diligently on was fine-tuning her speaking voice. She knew that an aristocratic British accent had a certain psychological effect on Americans. It certainly soon did on Samuel Goldwyn. He recalled that first impression. She has the trick, so I found, of convincing you that her voice is some far-away, mysterious visitant of which she herself supplies only a humble and temporary instrument of escape. It sounded like some lonely Buddha's prayer echoing down through the ages from the far heights of Tibet. In fact, she was taught by Gritsko that there was an unconscious magical effect to the voice. Especially when subtly combined with hand gestures and eye movements. As well, she was used to a low-key, mutually respectful business approach in her publishing deals. With people from her own background and culture. What was it going to be like dealing with total strangers with vastly different backgrounds, and high-pressure expectations? She had heard enough anecdotal gossip to feel trepidation when confronting them on their turf. Another unknown. Finally, with the sight of New York coming into view, she gave herself another reminder. Jotting it down in her diary and underlining it in black ink. If you constantly think of fine and prosperous things, you must be connecting yourself with the currents which can bring them into material form. On the dock she was flattered that Jesse Lasky himself came to meet her. He was the man she would have to answer to. Feeling a joyful burst of energy, she insisted on walking, rather than driving, down Fifth Avenue. Drawing gaping looks from motorists, bedazzled by her exotic appearance. Lasky could barely keep up. But New York was just the next point of departure. 5 days on a well-equipped train took her to the desired destination. When she stepped off, took a deep breath and looked around, she exclaimed to no one in particular, "I feel 10 years younger." The Hollywood Hotel was the only feasible residence for movie people. And Elinor joined their ranks. Compared to the palatial and elegant hotels familiar to her in Europe, this was just a rickety wooden building. There was no familiar suite of rooms, so arrangements were made to improvise by using 2 adjoining rooms. And she immediately refurnished it in her gaudy, colorful, eclectic tastes. Tiger rug most prominent, trunk after trunk was hoisted up the stairs by struggling movers. Massive arrays of shoes, clothing, furnishings, accessories, books, and furniture made the creaky stairs groan even more. A veteran traveler, she turned each stop into a version of her own comfortable lair. Gloria Swanson recalled her first entry. Her suite at the Hollywood Hotel looked like a Persian tent with divans, scarlet drapes, purple pillows, gongs, Buddhas, crystal balls, tarot cards, yarrow sticks, oriental rugs, and a giant tiger skin that went everywhere with her. Squeezed in were her personal secretary and maid, Blinky. And the dressmaker, Miss Morgan. Despite her bravado, she was still disoriented in her early days. Observing and absorbing a very different culture. What struck her sensibilities right away was the age difference between her and most everybody connected with the industry. She had been used to the gentle slope of aging within her peer group. But here she seemed isolated, surrounded by most who were decades younger. It made it easier to take on the role of sage advisor, which added credibility to her intentions. Though inwardly she chafed at the realization that she wasn't as young as she imagined herself to be. Youth was an unquestionable physical fact, but she quickly saw that most of the finest examples she spotted were lacking in maturity and worldly astuteness. Though their attractive appearances still made her blood rush. She thought Hollywood was full of what she called splendid raw materials, and would soon be spending an inordinate amount of time seeking out and evaluating those who caught her fancy. Constantly in search for the perfect man, she declared. And her mission, of defining and promoting an enticing blend of romance and sexual wisdom, would need to be carefully packaged and presented to be effective, while not crossing censorship lines or drawing the scrutiny of the moral crusaders. Her age, pedigree, aristocratic ties, elegant demeanor, refined voice and articulate vocabulary diffused most of the suspicions that she would be a threat. Despite her past controversy, which she patiently explained if asked, in benign terms. Constructing that persona gave her authority on her subject matter and reassurance for the studio that things were in line within moral boundaries. Even while some content suggested much that crossed those lines. Despite gaining public and industry respect and attention, her own desire for love and its rewards was simmering below the surface, waiting to be satiated. To others, her age, stature and ethical pronouncements protected her from suspicions of sexual dalliances and torrid affairs. All her talk about romance, love and sex was assumed to be based on her own past experiences. Very few ever bothered to question her deeply about her present. And she was deftly able to diffuse the most insistent. As she discovered quickly, everyone has their secrets. Her self-image was that she represented a timeless, classical type of beauty with perennial appeal. Not unlike that seen in classical art. Just slightly more mature, and tweaked to accent or disguise where she felt necessary. Wardrobe and styles also designed to evoke her intended reactions. Perhaps she didn't realize that young Hollywood eyes might not share her aesthetic values. Patsy Ann Miller, the most engaged girl in Hollywood, had this to say. She looked like the cover of one of her sensational novels. With a few years added. She had a fine, firm Valkyrian figure which was adorned with drapery and floating scarfs. Her hair was an incredible mahogany color. Her eyelids matched the green of her eyes. And her eyebrows were fiercely black and horizontal, which wasn't the fashion at the time. And Gloria Swanson recorded her own impression. Her British dignity was devastating. She was the first woman I'd seen wearing false eyelashes. And although she was old enough to be my grandmother, she got away with it. She had small squinty eyes and took tiny steps when she walked. Her teeth were too even and white to be real. She smelled like a cathedral full of incense and she talked a blue streak. Her hair was the color of red ink, and she wrapped it around her head like an elaborate turban. She was like something from another world. But she was there to work, and had always taken her writing seriously. On arriving at the studio, with her scenario completed for the great moment, she expected to be thanked for her thorough, professional work. And to be a major part of the production team. That's when she found out how Hollywood really works. Her story was changed in major ways. Important elements of it were deleted, rearranged, and given a different slant. Serious parts were turned farcical, and the ending went through changes till DeMille endorsed her suggestions. Despite her protestations, she wasn't in charge. And she became essentially a sideline advisor about appearances, geography, manners, style and character definition. She cringed at all the misrepresentations and fought for authenticity where possible. But the one key scene when she stood her ground, was to have the poison sucked from Gloria Swanson's snake bite moved from wrist to shoulder. A compromise over her first choice of bosom. But fear of censors modified the exposed body part. She had an uneasy truce with director Sam Wood, who didn't share her vision and was preoccupied with his side job as a realtor. The movie made money and was deemed a success. And as her career continued she learned more about production and what was demanded by the studio. Away from work, she became a popular figure on the Hollywood scene. Instantly recognizable, and with a somewhat intimidating reputation, that burned through the gossip grapevine. At the hotel she gave tea parties for the younger generation, attended Thursday night dances, and imparted her wit and wisdom to the assembled group gathered in her room. And she quickly ascended higher in the stratosphere by socializing in the highest echelon of stars. Chapter 8. As in Europe, Elinor gravitated to the highest circles of the elite. Hollywood royalty was the entertainment emulation of the real thing, of which her familiarity and experience fascinated Douglas Fairbanks, the undisputed king of the celluloid screen. Dwelling with his queen, Mary Pickford atop their mansion on the hill, Pickfair. Fairbanks had a weakness for reputation and royalty. But the couple were self-conscious about their status, and were very selective about who they permitted to enter their circle. With Elinor passing the threshold of success with her inaugural foray into their domain of dream-making, she was deemed worthy of one of their sought-after invitations. On a formal printed card, no less. Elinor was a probationary choice as a guest. A newcomer who might yet prove unable to sustain success. But someone who was generating attention. So even to satisfy their curiosity the invitation was delivered. The royal couple need not have worried. There was instant compatibility. Douglas was duly impressed. Mary had modeled and purchased clothes from her sister Lucy, and felt she was an appropriate guest. Elinor appreciated the formality, the etiquette, the more basic food choices. And approved that each one was meticulous about maintaining their looks and health. And in that environment Elinor had more intimate conversations with many of the luminaries. Charlie Chaplin became a permanent friend, and at Pickfair shared frank and humorous occasions with her. Even some improvised games of charades. Though coming from the opposite poles of British society, and living with very different lifestyles, they each were able to penetrate the social masks of the other, and maintain an authentic friendship. Another important figure of prominence that she dined with at Pickfair was William Randolph Hearst. 2 years older than her, he was one of the few in Hollywood of her age group. She was still on his payroll writing for his publications, and he thought she would be a good influence over Marion Davies, his much younger longtime mistress. Elinor had met Marion when she was staying at the Hollywood Hotel. and enjoyed her fun-loving company. But Hearst built her a humongous mansion on the Santa Monica beach. And there were always raucous parties taking place. Hearst hoped that Elinor could help tone down these affairs. Unbeknown to Hearst, Davies and Gloria Swanson had inaugurated Elinor into the lifestyle of the young, taking her to the hottest night spots and encouraging her to keep enjoying the search for the perfect man. Elinor tried to deflect their playful banter with her aloof sense of humor. But inwardly she was already intently perusing the raw talent. Quickly learning all the new dances and indulging in her enjoyment of dancing, she began to imperceptibly lose the delicate balance between her public persona and her fuller private self. But discretion was essential. She had become the female role model and expert advisor about appropriate sexual behavior. And the ever-prying eyes of the gossip columnists could damage her career if caught behaving contrary to her own words. As well, the censorship movement was gaining momentum. The moguls had shrewdly appointed former high political figure, Will Hayes, as their guardian and guide for acceptable story content. And Hayes produced a list of things that couldn't be dealt with explicitly. Particularly, the presentation of sexual suggestiveness in visual and plot form. During the next decade those guidelines were blurred and often avoided via clever techniques. But Elinor recognized at that time that her stories and private behavior would be scrutinized more diligently than ever. A favorite night spot was the elegant patent leather room in the Ambassador Hotel. She and Swanson would go there regularly. Swanson with director Marshall Nealon, who she was having an affair with. Elinor with one of a revolving cast of young escorts. Her presence at the door got them the best table. Elinor's growing status in the community was noted by a multitude of outsiders, hoping to use her as a portal to establishing their own careers. She was now busily working on a major project. An adaptation of her story, Beyond the Rocks, starring Swanson and the current male sex idol, Rudolph Valentino. Hollywood was buzzing in anticipation. Whether it was an inflated ego, belief in her unassailable judgment, or just extreme confidence, Elinor felt that she could demagnetize any bad influences around her by exertion of a strong will to create a protective armor. And even would be safe in behaving in ways that contradicted her principles. Since so much that she visualized in her meditations came to pass in one way or another, she felt capable of handling any repercussions. Perhaps some side effects of the Kundalini, or her tiger power, were manifesting more easily in the Hollywood environment, inflating her sense of power and control. A different tone from her public stance is evident in her diary entries. When I am bad I am deliberately so, knowing I must pay. I become savage when I require happiness. I must indulge in that over which I am a master. Indulgences are our recompense, our rights when we have obtained dominion and they have become our slaves. To be enjoyed only when and for so long as our wills permit it. If you say it is strong then you've lost the fight and your indulgences will savage you with a scorpion whip. One of the young men in her regular rotation was a superb dancer named Dana Todd. Arriving from Oklahoma, he was trying to establish himself as an actor, but only had work as an extra. Elinor noticed him dancing with energy and flair. He resembled somewhat one of her iconic characters. Paul, from 3 Weeks. Tall, blonde, with rugged but attractive features. They began with some casual dancing. Then conversation. He was modest, but showed a determination to keep trying to succeed. Despite disappointment so far, he was about half her age, but was casual and comfortable around her. He didn't make advances, but remained close. Elinor was listening to him, but more curious about his intentions. She was well aware of how older influential or rich women were regularly flattered and seduced, just to be exploited. A common practice seen in her European circles. But she still trusted her judgment. And enjoyed his presence. He injected a feeling of non-committal fun. And the age difference wasn't an obstacle to the rapport they were building. He was making her feel younger. She was dazzling him with anecdotes from another world. He said that he was dating casually, but nothing serious yet. Without prompting, Elinor told him that she would keep her eyes open and see if she could find an opportunity for him. Swanson and others had noted them together on multiple occasions. But Elinor laughed it off and gave all the obvious reasons why it couldn't be serious. But like most everybody else in Hollywood, she was lying. And now had her own secret to conceal. Working hard over a period of months, she needed time and space away from the intensity and demands of the studio and her magazine writing. She and Todd discreetly would meet and do silly things. Picnics, bicycle rides, eat at diners, and the like. So out of character for the official Madam Glyn that no one would believe that it could be her. Inevitably, romance ensued on a beach, and was repeated in locales that wouldn't be believed possible from her official self. The infusion of passionate vitality seemed to enthuse her. The work was going well, if not as she had imagined, but the end result was what mattered here. Money was becoming abundant. She felt the confidence to use it for enjoyment. She reflected later that she was addicted to money, just as much as she was to romance. She picked a financial manager mostly because of his good looks, without due diligence. When his name was mentioned to her, they urged her to be careful. Hollywood was full of sharks and embezzlers. But with supreme trust in her own powers of discernment, she signed a horrendous deal, giving up 50% of her combined earnings to an agent. It wasn't illegal, just the result of carelessness and belief that she could trust people based on her perceptions of them. And even more bad choices with investments lost her more, including a dud of a gold mine. Despite greater success, her money steadily disappeared. And she was oblivious of this until too late. The fun endured till it didn't. But while it did, she spent lavishly and indiscriminately, catering to every whim and impulse. She had helped Todd through the front door, gaining him small parts in 5 movies. Everything for Sale, The Last Card, Kisses, The Wallflower, Remembrance, and promoting him to play the lead in her next project, the adaptation of 3 Weeks. But this was immediately rejected. Todd was at a dead end. And so was their relationship. It wasn't exploitive, each was using the other for their own ends. Elinor enjoyed the chance to release her inner tiger. He was an interesting change of partner. And she was genuinely helping him. He was fond of her, enjoyed the uniqueness of her character and the depths of her passion. She was generous. He was appreciative. The talks she had with Bradley, her reading of Plato and Herodotus, big picture encouragement from Gritsko all receded into the background. Her inferior self was dominating her conscious mind. Ideals of the superior self were still dealt with in depth in her written works, especially her magazine pieces, but they were products of her head, more than her heart. Chapter 9. Invigorated from her immersion in the pool of youthful enthusiasm, she started to equivocate, now more personally sympathetic to their realities, and scolding the moralists for their accusations. In one of her articles she stated her thoughts. Poor young and undisciplined, beautiful creatures. Most of them under 25. It is so easy for ugly old men and withered elderly spinsters, who seem to think they are the guardians of public morals, to thunder and denounce. In spite of the fact that she was closer in age to spinsterhood than to the young beautiful creatures, she thought of herself youthful in spirit, and in her mind, still displaying the essence of her prime appearance. The beautiful third of the Platonic triad of values was the one she most cherished above truth and goodness. Though in her mission as a guide for future romantic behavior, always promoted holistic advice for integration of body, soul, spirit. With her comfort zone in Hollywood expanding, she saw opportunities beyond film, but still needed more success and reward within the industry. And her next project could be one that did that. California at that time was a magnet for all kinds of cults, sects, fringe belief systems, philosophies, each with their own leaders, agendas and promoters. It was estimated that there were over 400, all vying for attention and new supporters. They ranged from the credible to the ludicrous. Necromancy, different forms of prognostication, palm readers, crystal ball gazers, automatic writers, trance mediums, and more. With focus on various interests: love, healing, aliens, ghosts, spirit communication, attainment of enlightenment, development of psychic powers. Ad infinitum. Dan Thomas, a local news reporter, cynically wrote, "Los Angeles probably has more fake religious leaders and more suckers than any other city." It was also reported that hundreds in the movie industry were involved in various of these activities, and that some paid astrologers yearly, hoping to know in advance if changes in the planets would affect their careers. So Elinor found herself in an environment that accepted her right to her own quirks and beliefs. Even Pickfair allowed seances in their oriental room. Despite Chaplin's cynicism, she expanded her meditation hour with automatic writing, allowing her subconscious or even deeper source to express itself starkly or cryptically. And she hired a medium for regular consultation, trying to find clues and direction for her career and her life, and to hopefully communicate with Gritsko or others advancing the same agenda. Rudolph Valentino had burst upon the scene in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and taken that fame to dizzying heights in The Sheik. As the archetypal Latin lover, he generated mass sexually aroused hysteria from women, and jealous resentment from men. Elinor recognized his personal sexual magnetism as a version of it, a term she used to designate those of either sex with a distinctive type of personal charisma. She tweaked and rephrased her definition multiple times, and soon it would be a worldwide talking point. But in her only collaboration with Valentino, there would be interference, compromises, and a failure to implement the vision as she had planned. Beyond the Rocks was an adaptation of her story, starring two of the hottest stars, Gloria Swanson and Valentino, together for the only time. The first time Elinor met Swanson, she was convinced that she had seen her in her Egyptian vision, now showing the same proportions and features that Elinor then vicariously observed. Her first words to her was that she was the reincarnation of that woman. Gloria was flattered but dismissive, thinking Elinor was one of the gullible cultists. But friendship developed when they worked on The Great Moment, and Swanson became her young protégé. Elinor refined her manners, corrected her gait and diction, changed her hairstyle, redid her wardrobe. For Beyond the Rocks, Elinor took on a similar role, fine-tuning things for the story, which involved changes to elaborate period costumes. Much to Elinor's delight, costumes of ancient Egypt and 18th century Versailles. Elinor again quarreled with Wood, insisting on authenticity down to the last detail. But the story went from her through other hands, and again she felt it was compromised. As well, the Hayes office had instituted a new code that dictated that a screen kiss could last no longer than 10 feet of film. So some of the romantic sizzle she wanted was reduced. However, she did orchestrate the romantic fantasy scene in Versailles to her satisfaction, turning theater-goers into captive voyeurs. And she was proud that she was able to advise Valentino to kiss the more sensitive palm of a woman's hand rather than its back. But working with Valentino brought with it a new problem in the person of Natasha Rambova, soon to be Valentino's second wife. Elinor had seen her in the corner of a set, sharing passionate exchanges with a cameraman. But she kept discreet, feeling a genuine liking for Valentino. In her travels to Italy, she had observed his type of Latin persona and felt comfortable with him. He too was friendly with her, and soon let her help write semi-biographical magazine pieces. And he too believed in reincarnation. And they both liked money. Rambova and Elinor clashed constantly. Rambova exerted control over Valentino's career, managing him to fulfill her own artistic vision. From a dance and design background, she had planned a different path for his future. And to show her contempt, she called Glyn's story a piece of costume trash. Ironically, Rambova too had largely similar esoteric views as Elinor, with ancient Egypt at the heart of their reincarnation meditations. Elinor thought that Rambova and she could have been followers of the same goddess. Rambova of Sekhmet, an earlier form with more of warrior traits, and Elinor of Basted, the later more feminine form. Beyond the Rocks was another box office winner. And Elinor, though still feeling restricted with her movie-making contributions, had her reputation boosted. She now was firmly established in the industry, regularly published in the press, and eyeing new ways to spread her influence, for profit and for promoting her philosophy of love. the title of a non-fiction book later to be published. And while her personal love life remained discreet, she still was seen at gala events, the best night spots and even at the monthly dances at the Swanky 60 Club, held at the Biltmore Bowl, joining the likes of Swanson, Valentino, Lasky, Lloyd, Chaplin, Warner, Goldwyn, Mayer, Negri, Nazimova, Talmadge, Shearer, Moore, Daniels. She wrote to her mother, expressing how she felt at that stage of her Hollywood adventure. "I am in blooming health and have never looked or felt so vigorous and full of spirits. The hard work suits me provided I can have my dancing at night. At present I do not want to marry any man because I love freedom and believe I have a foot on the ladder of being really rich." Chapter 10. As Gritzko had warned, the new decade indeed was one of chaotic change to the established order. The Roaring Twenties did roar. Political, cultural, interpersonal currents were rapidly washing away the stability of older sensibilities. Despite anticipating and contributing to the emerging modernist revisioning, she was still a product of the old order, and valued the foundational standards that were internalized as trusted and true. She struggled processing the changes, and the often cynical rejection of tradition. She wrote frankly, "I do not know where things are going to. Etiquette of all sorts disappeared. Now manners and even decency have gone. We are rapidly becoming savages, openly seizing whatever good thing is offered to us, no matter from whom, and then throwing it aside the instant we catch sight of something new. But always going with the tide unless one is strong enough to stem it." At her age there was a psychological comfort in maintaining continuity. Yet she was keenly aware that progress was critical in many areas. And she felt excitement being in position to guide the new wave without totally demolishing the most enduring values. But things weren't proceeding in an orderly transition. She was enthusiastic at the challenge, and focused on her mission in changing the prevailing attitudes about the sexual behavior and needs of women. From her esoteric perspective, helping shape a mindset that would become integrated into the emerging new root race. Yet when she looked around, she saw that progress wasn't assured. Writing in her diary, she acknowledged the uncertainty of guiding change smoothly. "The whole world seems feverish. The spirit of progress has awakened after hundreds of years of sleep, and it is disturbing everything. In all boiling the scum rises to the top. We are at this period. We can but watch and wait. One can only speculate how soon a cauldron will boil over. One cannot be sure the direction the liquid will fly." Her career was also in a transitional state. Her contract with Lasky ended. Scandals still were common. Censorship demands were increasing. Hayes using his persuasive skills to both appease the critics while giving the industry space to finesse their productions. A dispute with Lasky about her next project led her to seek other options. A tentative arrangement with Pickford, Fairbanks United Artists fell through. With limited choices, she had to accept an offer from Mayer, Goldwyn, MGM. The money wasn't what she hoped for, but the promise of more control was enticing. Her most famous novel, 3 Weeks, was on the agenda. She was told that she could write the screenplay and have a larger role in the direction. This was an opportunity to revive and present her iconic story in visual, live-action form. A new dimension, and a means of transmitting her most explicitly crafted message to a younger generation. She was allowed time for a vacation before production started. And this was most welcome. Her mind was swirling with thoughts about expanding her presence for a larger audience and generating more income. She already had just earned $500 for a single 15-minute talk. And she realized that she had become a brand of sorts. Her name constantly in print and on the radio. Yet it seemed that no matter how much she thought she had, her manager was vague about details. But she trusted that her positive visualizations would perpetually guide her to ample replenishment. Sailing with Chaplin, Pickford, and Fairbanks to Europe allowed her to put her Hollywood self on hold temporarily. In Europe she had another identity. Her family in fact didn't even know her as she was in the American environment. All they had were letters and telegrams. And in the meantime they were living their own lives, critical portions of which she had missed. She didn't attend either daughter's wedding, but now was able to see her first grandchild. Her daughter Margot felt something unsettling about her mother. From some of their letters she sensed that some questions were being avoided or deflected. Telling her husband, Rhys Williams, of her nagging doubts, they remained suspicious about Elinor's evasive answers. And when asked about her financial status, Elinor painted an all-positive picture, hinting at the chances for multiplying her income. But she admitted that she had lost track of the actual numbers, but was trusting her manager to keep everything in order. Aware of her mother's gullibility, cavalier treatment of money, and her spending habits, Margot felt even more concern. And on his insistence, she did show Rhys Williams some paperwork she had with her. And that raised serious alarm for them. But Elinor just laughed it off, saying that abundance will always be there if she maintains the right attitude. But seeing those contracts couldn't be dismissed so easily. After much serious talk, Elinor was persuaded, for her own good, to let them turn her into a limited liability company. It was easier now for her to not be bothered with details. But in time she realized how much control she had ceded over future content, and her access to funds for immediate gratification. More tension ensued when asked about her personal life. She sent mixed signals. From comments from some friends who had visited her in Hollywood, they had heard disquieting rumors about her active social life, and how much she had been seen escorted by a variety of men. Again, Elinor just dismissed any suspicion, telling them they had no idea about the Hollywood lifestyle. It was perfectly normal and accepted behavior for celebrities to be seen at the choicest places. In fact, it was positive for their careers. The public devoured gossip and pictures. And the men were mostly from within the industry, out for casual flirtations and an evening of dining and dancing. A respite from the grind of the business. How could they suspect anything untoward? And feeling indignant about being questioned along these lines, she reminded them that she was unmarried, still vibrant, and free to do as she pleases. Their stereotyping of her was for their convenience, not a reflection of living reality. And she emphasized the point by showing her disgust for those who withdraw from a full life. Ascetics are worse than sensualists. They are failures, weaklings, not permitting themselves the smallest indulgence. They are afraid to enter the arena at all. They have all withered. Her answer seemed too defensive to her daughter, who knew her mother only too well. But she didn't press the issue. It was true, she knew nothing of Hollywood. Busy for the rest of this vacation, Elinor moved her mother to a new house, reopened her apartment in Paris, and spent time in Spain. Initially disgusted and repugnant at bullfights, she felt she ought to attend to gather impressions for a future book, which became Letters from Spain. But she became aroused by the bloodlust, and felt the ferocity and savagery that was kept repressed, starting to seep out. She called it her wild, tigerish and primitive emotions. It alarmed her, but deep down she identified with the emotion and its need for expression, and made up her own Darwinian theory. All living things, animal or human, have a vein of cruelty in them if they are strong. And custom deadens any horror after a while. She rationalized this as another safety valve for society, keeping it from worse things. European interlude over, and the masks of identity have to be switched once more. Environment determined her self-image and its representation to others. Here she was the aristocratic presence. There she would become the sagacious and eccentric Madame Glyn once more. With the resumption of her Hollywood career and identity, there was a new studio with new players and problems to deal with. But before returning to Hollywood she stopped off in New York, and gave a series of 10-minute talks in a vaudeville theater, on woman's place in modern civilization, and marriage customs. The money was well worth her time. Focus shifted again to the major project. Flattered that Mayer and Thalberg met her at the train station, they drove her to her new residence, a more expansive suite at the Ambassador Hotel, which she promptly remodeled and filled with new additions of every kind. Again, with her eclectic tastes. The studio emerging from Metro was now becoming the young MGM led by Louis B. Mayer, with Samuel Goldwyn now in his brief tenure there. and gifted young Irving Thalberg rising as the most savvy judge of potential future hit projects. Ideally, featuring class and quality. 3 Weeks was seen as an attractive property. The book was a sensation, and still selling well. The author, Elinor Glyn, was a recognized popular author, and now had proven success in the movie industry. As well, her name and presence was strong. Her print comments were succinct and controversial. Critically, her specialty was selling sex, though packaged with the refining qualifications of romance and love. And she came with an aura of maturity and authority. On signing with that company, Elinor was promised more input and control, which were improvements from her earlier contributions, but still far short of what she preferred. Casting was the first big obstacle. For years she had her mental images of Paul and the lady etched in her mind, but now faced accepting real-world counterparts, who couldn't possibly match her ideal couple. She suggested one of the current young men that she was seeing, Eric Glyn Percy. Inexperienced, he was immediately rejected. He had dyed his dark hair blonde in vain. The production was going to be costly, a big box office return had to be ensured. The studio picked one of their established stars to play Paul, Conrad Nagel. Elinor was aghast. Nagel was wrong on so many levels. He was German, the antithesis of her idealized British hero. She took this as an insult, and realized she didn't have the control they promised. She had more input in selecting the lady. The role was considered to be a prime showcase, and hundreds of actresses were tested. Elinor was obsessed. She finally found an acceptable choice. Aileen Pringle, who had a resemblance to her younger self. Twin profile pictures of them were taken for publicity purposes. And there was added snob appeal for her, who never forgot about bloodlines and lineage. Pringle's father-in-law was the governor of Jamaica. So invested in the proper portrayal, Elinor demonstrated herself how Pringle should act. King Vidor directed, giving her more input than she had before. Despite the high production costs, the film was a success and turned a profit. The lavish sets and costumes were effective, and the story titillated, but kept the sexual suggestiveness within acceptable censorship boundaries. Especially with the price of punishment paid at the end. Elinor was proud and full of self-confidence once more, after being suspiciously treated in England. Her Hollywood persona was becoming her only self-image. She easily compartmentalized her thoughts, and prioritized even more money, fame, and success in her meditations. Her mission of stretching paradigms of sexual conduct became secondary. Not an end in itself, nor an expression of bold thinking, but more an identifiable theme, promoted implicitly or explicitly, and monetized with supplemental exposure. She wrote non-fiction books over the next few years to capitalize on her name recognition. The Point of View, The Philosophy of Love, Keep Young and Beautiful, The Elinor Glyn System of Writing, The Wrinkle Book, or How to Keep Looking Young. And she was pictured in advertisements endorsing different products. Her magazine articles were plentiful and controversial enough to keep her name current. And now appearing in magazines were advertisements for her books with outlandish promises, rivaling many fast-buck artists. Promotions for The Philosophy of Love made it seem imperative that every adult needed to devour her wisdom to obtain lasting happiness. As was shown in bold and italicized print, Elinor Glyn, author of 3 Weeks, has written an amazing book that should be read by every man and woman, married or single. The Philosophy of Love is not a novel. It is a penetrating searchlight fearlessly turned on the most intimate relations of men and women. The ad goes on and on, promoting how life-changing the book will be. The content was serious, lucid, and well within her objective of expanding the horizons of thoughts about sex. She was becoming adept at using different vehicles to get her thoughts across. Novels, non-fiction books, magazine and newspaper content, advertisements, radio, speaking tours, and generating more income in the process. As well, she claimed to have discovered or refined a slew of actors. Some her protégés, others who she advised. For starters, Harriet Hammond, David Meir, Dagmar Desmond, Mike Mitchell, and the handsome young aviator, Art Goebel. Her continued search for the perfect man was still ongoing. And the candidates with raw talent came and went. But there was a more serious relationship on the horizon. Chapter 11. An intriguing element to her next film project was a scene in His Hour, her second project for MGM. For her private reasons she named the protagonist Gritsko. And the key scene was love-making under furs on a sled. John Gilbert played Gritsko. Elinor, as assistant director, created an intricately devised episode that ran for 300 or 400 feet of film. She carefully attended to every detail. The lovers are nearly horizontal, and Gilbert kisses Aileen Pringle, as Tamara, starting at her fingertips working his way to her cheeks, caressing them with his eyelashes. The haze censors cut most of the scene, pleasing director King Vidor. Elinor was able to unleash her memories and vicariously create a similar scenario, but not come close to revealing the extent of the real events. But it seemed that she missed his presence and needed to create a partial simulation. But in the end her emotions were still uplifted. She recalled how she was able to do the job to her satisfaction. We had to do the snow night scenes, and one night I had my triumph. It was worth sitting up all night for. The director was ill and asked me to direct the sequence of the wedding evening myself, a proof at last of what I can unaided do. Flattered by the praise of Fairbanks and Pickford, she believed she was mastering the film-making medium. She also remembered her mission as a pioneer of new romantic paths for the future. She boldly wrote to her mother, "I am going to make pictures that will be a light to humanity." Fully ensconced in the social circle of the elite, she enjoyed being feted and respected. And she moved more freely into Hearst's world. She was part of a group, along with Chaplin and his wife Lita, stranded in a broken shack overnight on their way to Hearst's Mexican estate. She was a frequent visitor at his San Simeon castle, discreet about his poor arrangement of priceless objects, and a victim of excrement hurled at her by Jerry, a monkey in Hearst's zoo. She was one of a select group on his yacht when Thomas Ince became deathly ill. Elinor's claim about having heightened senses was taken seriously by many of her friends. And just before Ince drank his fateful toast, she warned of ominous consequences by toasting on water. Her description of those events were as ambiguous as the statements of others. But she did say she was sworn to secrecy. At MGM she was given more responsibility and relished having more control. They produced Man and Maid, where she appears in the opening credits, writing the words, "What we call coincidence is nothing but the weaving of destiny's threads for a given end which we cannot see." A belief she ardently agreed with her entire life. This movie was followed by The Only Thing, another of her Ruritanian romances, and the last to be adapted to film. Box office success was fading by now. Goldwyn thought that tastes were changing. It was halfway through the decade. The flapper role model had become dominant for young women. The Victorian mindset no longer resonated. The slick, streamlined modernist aesthetic prevailed. Despite her still relevant ideas about women and sex, the framework of her presentations weren't cutting edge anymore. She would have to revamp and adapt or lose relevance. And to complicate matters, daughter and son-in-law burst into her Hollywood life. Now fully aware of her financial entanglements, Rhys Williams tried to intimidate those she was contracted to. It worked with her agent. But going up against Louis B. Mayer was another story. Thalberg had prepared a generous offer for Elinor which she signed. But Rhys Williams had Mayer cancel it. Her MGM days were over. Her family now knew the potential income from royalties, productions, endorsements, amongst other streams of income, would be more substantial than first believed. And both for self-interest and Elinor's long-term future, they relieved her of financial independence. Having to have the approval of her new money managers was humbling, but Elinor still enjoyed her lifestyle and visualized new opportunities. But one of the requests she made to Rhys Williams was to give her newest young man a job as her business manager. At a steep salary of £5,000 per year. More than the Prime Minister was earning. Elinor was impressed by the appearance of John Wynne, a young Etonian Englishman. She was impressed by his dancing Appearance and dancing skill always were important criteria for making a good first impression. And a bonus was that he resembled an old lover, Alstair in his cur. Following a familiar pattern, they socialized casually, then became more serious. He and Elinor shared 2 days of partying at Marion Davies' beach house, with Millicent, the Duchess of Sutherland, and another young man Elinor procured for her. And when Valentino and Pola Negri demonstrated the proper form for the tango, Elinor seemed to forget her disgust for the dance that she had ridden before her seduction by Hollywood. All the blue bloods, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, taking tango lessons. A nation loses all sense of balance and belies the traditions of its whole history, when masses of civilized individuals experience this craze for dancing and miming and sex display. It presages some great upheaval, some calamity. Glyn ingratiated himself into her life, and slyly started to take advantage. He gave her business advice, said that he was pursuing opportunities, opened her mail, spread rumors about studio figures. To her, he was just giving her great comfort, and was saving her trouble. But her letters home were more revealing. She described how the same foursome from the Davies party regularly went out for fun. "We just go out dining and dancing. So entertaining. 2 grandmothers, both really rather attractive, with 2 of the very best-looking young men you ever saw. 2 enchanted to be with us and in years young enough to be our sons." Perhaps she was so enraptured by the attention, flattery and virility of a young man who ignored obvious age differences, and brought back a self-image of herself at the same state of youth. He also had the British look and background that she had always desired and appeared in her fiction. Her own inner tiger seemingly wasn't dormant. Awakening that force rejuvenated her whole being. It fit with Bradley's characterization of the dual nature of the self, and that the inferior self can never embody all the ideals of the superior self. Allowing herself the pleasure of these indulgences was a manifestation of one part of who she was, equally authentic as her idealistic side. And as she was now seeing her mission, constant renewal of sexual pleasure throughout a lifespan was only a theory before. Her archetypal, older, lady was still of childbearing age as was she when the book was written. Actually experiencing it past middle age was a verification. And so what if her recent partners were notably younger? Gritsko looked of indeterminate age. Probably younger than her too. The reverse has always been accepted as a fact of life. Perhaps this is another sexual paradigm that needs to be integrated into the new age, without the stigma of traditional judgments. Chapter 12. Elinor walked a fine line as she and the decade moved inexorably forward. She was past 60, further removed from the tastes of youth. Not a promoter of the flapper lifestyle, or of the excesses of the jazz age. She didn't drink hard liquor, smoke, or take drugs. But her eyes were open and her observations succinct. Her occult beliefs also added another layer of disapproval. She made her thoughts clear. The spirits of morphine and nicotine draw misfortune and bodily decay. Every farce has to have its congenial atmosphere or it cannot exist. Well-known people in the literary and artistic sections of the world of fashion, of high rank and intelligence. They both smoke and take drugs. Not only do they hurt their bodies but drawing spiritual ills as well. They have surrounded themselves with the drab demagnetizing currents which envelope the body when human beings give up their wills. It would be difficult for anything good to pierce through such ambiance. She wasn't prudish or trapped by the mindset of her upbringing. And she had been attending the most lavish and indulgent parties her entire life. And been witness to all forms of dissipation. But her husband died a drunk, and she valued self-control and willpower. Adapting her message without diluting it for jazz-age sensibilities was a challenge. She was trying to keep the promotion of woman's sexual independence within her older framework of courtship and delayed gratification, while yet realizing the zeitgeist was moving the world into this new age faster than expected. Gritsko's mapping of changing eras and civilizations seemed static when looked at from a distance, but living within this dynamic meant acting quickly or risk irrelevance. Elinor had managed to finesse her philosophy from Edwardian through early post-war cultural change. But now she saw that she was losing momentum. Still popular within certain demographic and economic groups, the youngest adults were tuning her out more than before. Leaving MGM, she ended up at Paramount, the new version of her old Lasky studio. Her first production for them was Ritzy, a failure to adapt to more modern sensibilities. Still writing for Hearst's Cosmopolitan magazine, she inadvertently found another gold mine in the making. Revamping some ideas about how to portray sex appeal, the simple word, it, became her magic carpet ride back to relevance and another round of fame and money. She ended up with many statements of slightly different definitions. But the essence was pure, innate, unself-conscious sex appeal. One of her definitions tried to incorporate everything. What is it? Fascination, animal magnetism, magnetic force, life itself, magnetic personality, mental ideals, sex attraction. It is none of these things. For it is all of them. It is it, and referring to the Cosmopolitan story she had this definition. It is that quality possessed by some few persons which draws all others with its magnetic life force. With it you win all men if you are a woman. And all women if you are a man. Without it you take a chance, and are not certain of winning anyone. Or keeping him or her if won. The story generated instant buzz. Discussions about the nuances of the definition were taking place everywhere. Jokes and poems were appearing. But it hadn't been exploited nearly enough. Elinor became a hot property again. Her expertise on sex now extended to becoming the ultimate authority about sex appeal. Giving her another angle to promote herself. She was in demand for lecture tours, radio appearances, publication interviews. A movie would generate the most interest and be a box office bonanza. At Paramount, Ben Schulberg had been an associate producer on Ritzy. And was sure that he had the perfect actress to embody it. Previously he tried to promote former typist Clara Bow as the Brooklyn Bonfire. That didn't go anywhere, but the petite redhead had some intangible qualities that were consistent with the definition. And looked right for the part. But that meant deviating from Glyn's written story, where it was a man who had it. Recognizing the earning potential, Elinor eagerly changed the story. She was a realist, and saw that the bow flapper type was replacing the more sophisticated type like Gloria Swanson. And Schulberg enticed Elinor's personal endorsement of Bow for a $50,000 bonus. Pictures of the two together appeared with Elinor's words. Of all the lovely young ladies I've met in Hollywood, Clara Bow has it. Bow at the time was in an awkward romantic situation with both Gilbert Roland and Victor Fleming. When she first met Elinor, she saw a 62-year-old redhead covered in purple veils, hiding the healing process of a facelift. Elinor treated her as if she were a crystal ball, placing her hands on her head and telling her that she was her medium. And had the honor of playing the leading lady of her story. And that she had the same inner magic as Valentino. The story was altered again, by Louis Layton and Hope Loring. A husband and wife team. Joseph von Sternberg shot important scenes. And Elinor coached and meddled on the sidelines. But she had a cameo appearance, walking like royalty, and describing the meaning of it. The film was a tremendous success, earning Paramount $1 million. Elinor basked in the revival of her popularity and profited greatly. And for months she went on a lecture tour. Now lecturing on it, as her current vehicle to promote an updated version of her sexual philosophy. The popularity of it was largely due to Bow's looks, mannerisms and modern lifestyle. Light years removed from Glyn's usual heroines. But indirectly, Elinor latched onto a concept that resonated with the current views and values of the target audience. With all her focus on prognostication and visualization, she hadn't anticipated this twist of fate. A charismatic working-class flapper, coming from poverty and a dysfunctional home, becoming the stimulus to her renewed popularity. But Elinor still maintained her snob persona as well, which seemed to reappear every time she was in Europe. Her pioneering mission to change perceptions about sex flourished in America. But in Europe she gravitated back to mixing with royalty and finding comfort in her old identity. Yet she remained conflicted. On return to Hollywood after a European vacation, she continued at Paramount, and was in full swing with Clara Bow again, producing the popular comedy, Red Hair. A fitting finale for her last Hollywood effort. Apparently she didn't hear, or chose to ignore Bow calling her a shithead. The pull of America was still strong. She knew with a certainty that the next root race would first take hold there, and that her work had made a modest contribution to promotion of the ideal of body, soul, and spirit, enriched by the pleasures of sex. But fate had another twist. Because of past financial mismanagement and massive tax bills, she would have to leave America, and never set foot in that modest house in Washington she had selected. Curzon and Milner had died. The world was changing even faster. She had to move back to Europe, and settled in England. Ensconced within her family again, she tried without success to stay relevant within the British film industry. The only form of film now was talking pictures. But there was no success. With her European mindset again becoming her only orientation, she wrote her autobiography, reflecting selectively from a distance of time and space. Her thoughts about how she lived in America now took on a bitter twist. Revising her memories to align with her recent views, she believed that she was under a California curse, an occult spell that was a form of hypnotism, distorting her true self and values. And there was no third visit from Gritsko to reinforce her importance and stir her repressed passions. No reward for doing her part to change cultural perceptions about women and sex on the cusp of the new age. The contrasting triads of values that she vacillated between and tried to synthesize were now seen as incompatible, and the antithesis of each other. She had given up the effort. Health, wealth and power are undoubtedly attracted to those who practice these acts, as I have proved, but only at the cost of sacrificing every fine moral and spiritual attribute and the complete annihilation of the sense of humor. My balance was upset. And if I'd stayed in America I would have fallen under the spell of this new named but as old worship of forbidden gods. I actually did for a time. 20 years later, it was made to seem quite natural and right that the ideals of health, wealth, and happiness were substitutes for truth, beauty, and goodness. And to demand in the name of God that a certain definite sum should be received by a certain date, or a particular contract should go through at a stated time. Even that one should possess some object of desire. I shudder now to think that I ever entertained these blasphemous and awful ideas. And my sense of humor abandoned me. I have good cause to thank my guardian angel for having twice brought about my escape before it was too late from the invisible occult influences which play a part in American life. The lifelong struggle between inferior self-indulgence and superior self-ideals was revisited at a time when she was able to detach herself from action and contemplate from the comforting tranquility of her writing desk. And instead of the smooth transition into the new age, it was seen as a reawakening of a Lemurian curse. Now transferred to California, I was told by a well-known clairvoyant that the whole of the west coast of America is suffering from the curse bequested for it by the old continent of Lemuria, which existed in prehistoric times in the Pacific, but disappeared after volcanoes. Because terrible things always seem to happen in California, it's hard not to fall under the Lemurian curse of the west coast. With the change in perspective, she reassessed her American experience, likening it to fairy tale enchantment. I confess I did not like the fairy tale of the evil fairy who was able to banish the real personality of those bewitched, forcing them against their will to carry out her commands and forget the land of their birth, the purpose of their journey, and many of the principles which they had held most dear. Directly connecting this curse to her Hollywood days, she said, "It had caused my abandonment of all previous standards of moral values. My natural character saved me from reaching the final stage. But it took a long time to shake off the insidious power of Hollywood. I compare it to the result of cocaine or some other terrible drug that shatters the moral fiber of its addicts. I shudder when I look at my diaries from California. For many of my ideals grew dimmed and my sense of values was entirely altered. I became completely self-centered, callous to a degree which seems incredible to me now. Strangest of all was the tremendous importance I attached to money. The desire to make more and more became the chief aim of my existence. Besides the now retrospective feeling of disappointment for compromising her core ideals, she acknowledged that she hadn't completed her mission to her own satisfaction. I intended to help humanity, but never put this into concrete shape. Yet, despite her own feelings, her contributions to cultural change via books, films, and anecdotal impressions have modestly endured past her lifetime. And her carefully crafted iconic appearance, stage-like public presence, and theatrical vocal mannerisms have been noted to have been factors in her popularity, enhancing interest in the content of her work. Had she been a recluse, it is doubtful that her message would have had the same impact. Her secretive private life stimulated her creative forces and replenished her energies. Sex had always been the central element of her productions, presented in fiction and expounded upon philosophically. And changing perceptions and appreciation of a woman's priorities was recognized as her mission. Her own indulgences were natural expressions of that side of her personality. Her occult beliefs and practices were pragmatically effective for her, as she even admitted, while later reframing her assessment. She felt that she had tangible, extrasensory sensitivity, and experienced lucid, paranormal episodes, firmly etched in memory. She shared her beliefs often and publicly, feeling no self-conscious embarrassment. And portions or all of those alternative beliefs were also shared by many others. And she felt she saw constant reminders that there were higher powers at work. Her life was a complex blend of shifting attitudes and priorities, sometimes integrated harmoniously, other times, discordant and contradictory, strongly influenced by environment and associates. In different settings she would show different personas, and easily change back when moving between them. Partly facade, partly instinctive. She had her core values, which sometimes were dominant, and often carefully enunciated and described in her writings and interviews. Drawn from her classical foundation with compatible upgrades, the Platonic triad of truth, beauty and goodness remained consistent. Other times obscured by pursuit of more transient, self-indulgent pleasures. With vanity, power of influence, ego gratification, status, appearance, and pursuit of money and pleasure variously dominating. Variations of the now rejected inverse triad of health, wealth and happiness. And as a single woman, she was free to seek romantic fulfillment on her terms. After a disappointing marriage and bittersweet affairs, she sought the perfect man to compensate and embody the ideals she rhapsodized about in her writings. Pursuing that objective was perfectly reasonable, given her valuation of the harmonious blend of romance, love, and sex. And recognition of the small odds of finding perfection meant settling for the next best thing. Whoever most appealed to her tastes, and accepted her on her terms. As someone who spent a lifetime prioritizing beauty and appearance, gravitating to youth was a natural inclination. A tempting contrast to the older men of her past affairs. Whether sincere or not, flattery and vanity inflated her ego and whet her sexual appetite. To abstain contradicts her philosophy and belief in her own desirability. Her intentional avoidance in her autobiography of mentioning any romantic activity in Hollywood can be interpreted differently. She may have been discreet, avoiding publicly naming names and bringing others into the open for gossip. She may have regretted her actions in retrospect, and didn't want posterity to know how she behaved in her middle age. She may have blocked some of her behavior out of her thoughts, not wanting to revisit them. She may have lost her appetite for sex, and avoided the subject. She was branded as a wise, elder, guru ofq sex on her arrival in Hollywood. Perhaps an easy persona to adopt without being exposed to the same scrutiny a younger person may have subjected to. But she admitted that she went through her old diaries, and was ashamed of her Hollywood lifestyle. If sex had not been part of that lifestyle, it would have been unusual. Given her professional focus and constant writing about sex, and her hyper-frantic nightlife, dancing with young men nightly, and seeking them out during the day to mentor and groom, she did let slip a few clues in her letters that alarmed her family. And comments from other Hollywood contemporaries who saw her in action also provoked their curiosity. In the end, she was a unique individual. A living bridge between eras who tried to invigorate tradition with progressive ideas while using traditional values to give the next generation guidance and structure. Either way, perceptions about women and sex weren't the same. And her mission did have an impact. Even if it didn't unfold as she expected.